Information theories. These are 17 information theories. The fundamental quantity information is a non-material entity. It is not a property of matter, so that purely matter processes are fundamentally precluded as sources of information. Okay, information, matter, and energy are three distinct and fundamental quantities of the universe. Matter and energy can be carriers of information, but they are not in themselves information. Information is something completely distinct and separate. Information only arises through an intentional volitional act. So, information is created by the mind as initiated by the will of the sender. That's how information is created. Information comprises a non-material foundation for all technological systems and for all works of art. Without the foundation of information, living matter would not exist. It would have no reason to exist without information. We all exist to communicate, from plants whose language of communication is color and odor, to insects, to humans, to human languages. Everything exists to communicate with everything else. A message which has been subject to interference or noise in general comprises more information than an error-free message. Void, now this goes back to our void definition. Information totality is complete randomness. This is the highest complexity available to any system, is complete randomness. This can be compared to static and noise. From this state, no meaning can be obtained. So from a state of complete randomness, which is what we supposedly came from, nothing can become distinct intervals or information. You can get no information from static noise. Shannon's definition of information exclusively concerns the statistical properties of sequences of symbols. Meaning is completely ignored. So Shannon's information theory is required to significantly evaluate information and information processing in both living and non-living systems, because it establishes boundaries of what is meaningful according to probabilities. A code is an essential requirement for establishing information. Matter alone is absolutely unable to generate any code. So a rock and particles or electrons and all these kind of things cannot by themselves establish a meaningful code. It has to be given to them. The allocation of meanings to the set of available symbols is a mental process depending on convention. So every taxonomic categorization that we talked about of every animate being is grouped according to the deliberate convention of code as contained in its DNA. So everything that we see as biology on the earth is a deliberate convention of the informational code of its DNA. Mutations are the result of the non-adherence to this code. Mutations have never been shown to produce new information. To my own Anatomy and Physiology 2 course, and I'm here at Western, we just talked about mutations. The only place in nature that you observe evolution is in malignant tumor cells. These cells reproduce randomly. They do not resemble their parent cells in any way. They're unencapsulated. They have no firmament around them anymore. That is the only place in nature we observe evolution at all. But what is it to the organism? Cancer is absolutely detrimental to the organism. You cannot have a cancerous organism reproduce, have more cancer, and go on to reproduce. It will die off. Sometimes, before you even know you have the cancer, you're dead. In many cases, as soon as you find out you have cancer, a few weeks later you're dead, before you can even reverse the process. So there's no way that mutations, which is a form of cancer, can ever be beneficial to an organism. Which is not a form of cancer. I misspoke there. But could be parallel to a type of cancer or beneficial to an organism. They are always detrimental to an organism. Okay. Now, if a code has been defined by a deliberate convention, it must be strictly adhered to afterwards. So if there was this deliberate convention based on DNA created in the beginning, coming from sound, which we've got to this point, from based on physics foundation. Now, it would have to be strictly adhered to afterwards in order to reproduce the system. And what do we see? Do we see that if this guy copulates with his wife, is he going to reproduce something after his own kind? Is it going to be strictly adhered to? Yes, it is. It's going to be strictly adhered to based on the information in the musical scale of the DNA. There's only certain notes in the musical scale. As a matter of fact, you only have 4 different types of proteins, A, G, T, C, I won't get into all that, but that's the scale. It's 4 notes long, and it creates all the diversity on the earth that you see today. Why? Because it's able to reproduce musical compositions based on those 4 notes in harmony. All right, now, it must be strictly adhered to afterwards. Now, if the information is to be understood, the particular code must be known to both the sender and the recipient. Now, you have all kinds of chemical messengers in your body, literally millions, okay? Now, they're all distinct. They all do a specific purpose. Some of them, you have like 1.2 trillion cells, right? 1.7 trillion cells. Now, some of these chemical messengers are only there to seek out one single cell. It has to find that by traveling through your bloodstream out of all those other 1.7 trillion cells. Now, how does it do that? Well, if it's listening for a certain message or a certain tone or sound, it would be easy to distinguish that out of 1.7 trillion other distinct tones or sounds. All right? So, the information code has to be understood by both the sender and the recipient. And they speak, the messenger, the chemical messenger, which is a hormone, speaks the same language as that one single cell out of 1.7 trillion that it's looking for. That's the only other thing in the body that it can speak to. And so it obviously knows, it finds its cell, its recipient cell, and then it can create changes in itself, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, 10. According to Theorem 6, only structures which are based on a code can represent information. This is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the establishment of information. 11. A code system is always the result of a mental process. Any given piece of information can be represented by any selected code. 13. Any piece of information has been transmitted by somebody and is meant for somebody else. And that's what we said earlier creation is about. Creation was created so that everything in creation can communicate with everything else. A sender and a recipient are always involved whenever and wherever information is concerned. And like we said earlier, they both have to be able to communicate. Now you can understand why you are here. If the universe, one word, is full of information and is not communicating, then it has no purpose to exist. So why would it exist at all? If there was no reason for it to exist, why would it exist? The truth is the whole universe and all information it contains in coded packets, whether it's stars, planets, plants, insects, animals, humans, it contains in coded packets is a message to you from the Creator. He is the sender of information by speaking all things into existence. But who is the recipient of the language of God that he spoke? If there was no recipient, there would be no reason to have a creation. So there has to be somebody that is a recipient of all this information we've been talking about that has been spoken into existence. Who is the recipient? But who is the recipient of the language of God except he who was created in his image, you? The whole creation at the end of Genesis was created for you. Why? Because he spoke it into existence so that you would hear the Creator's word through creation. For what purpose would an intelligent being have to create all those varying levels of code if only to speak to himself? Right. There would be no reason to have a creation if he was just trying to talk to himself. So he created you to be the receiver of the information that he was sending through creation. That is the reason why information exists. There's no other reason for information to exist except to communicate between two intelligent beings. 14. Any entity to be acceptable as information must entail semantics. It must be meaningful. The purpose of information is to transfer meaning. So if everything was based on evolution, it would have no meaning. It would be complete noise. There would be no reason for it to exist. It would not transfer any meaning to you at all. It would be meaningless and purposeless to you. The highest amount of information contained in the least amount of symbols, A, G, T, C, or A, B, C, D, E, F, G through C, the highest amount of information contained in the least amount of symbols is optimal. And the simplest configuration 12 distinct nodes on a keyboard representing millions of possible nodes. Evolution teaches us that we go from simplest configuration to the most complex, meaning that the most information should be contained in the highest amount of symbols, according to evolution. This idea leads us back to the definition of void that we established in the beginning. DNA shows us exactly the opposite of evolution, that all the diversity on the planet can be described in 4 protein symbols, A, G, T, C. The greatest amount of information in the least amount of symbols contains the highest amount of meaning. And this was creation at the beginning. 15. When its progress along the chain of transmission events is traced backward, every piece of information leads to a mental source, the mind of the sender. And it's because of this reverse engineering process that we can trace the information of creation back to its original source by this process. This is how we can prove there was a creator. Knowing 2 things. One, that Ford invented the Model T, and that Ford invented the automobile, and 2, having a Model T in front of me, I can take apart the Model T, put it back together, and reproduce the process by which Ford invented the Model T. That's what this theorem is talking about. By doing so, I have proven the statement, Ford invented the automobile. This is exactly what I've accomplished in my book, and what I'm trying to accomplish with this theory and presentation to you today. And I'll probably produce it for you today. Creationists have a statement. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And all around us, we have the heavens and the earth. By the process of reverse engineering, the deconstruction and reconstruction of biological systems, we are proving there is a creator and that the statement is true. This is what the scientific method is all about. At the same time, scientists, by the same process, are disproving any theory that relies on natural causes. If a chain of symbols comprises only a statistical sequence of characters, it does not represent information. Evolution likes to say, out of an infinite set of possibilities, then such and such could occur at least one time. All it takes is one time out of an infinite amount of possibilities. This is true in the sense that noise will always create more noise. You will always have an infinite amount of possibilities and recreate more possibilities in noise. And never a coherent signal. But it is a false presumption when considering that an outside force interintelligent would be required to change the direction of the outcome, according to Newton's laws of motion. So if you begin with noise, it'll only reproduce more noise. It cannot produce information. It would require an outside source or outside force beyond that ball of noise to change the path that noise would take. Does that make sense? It requires an outside force. If I were to roll the ball across this stage, it would require an outside force to change the direction of that ball. If you began with information totality, a void of information, or complete randomness of information, then it would require an outside physical entity to change the direction of that void. Otherwise, it would always just remain a void. And this is what we see in the beginning of Genesis. The Holy Spirit moved upon the void, and God said, let there be light, and create light. That's why we start the presentation. 17. Information always entails a pragmatic aspect. Pragmatic aspect means it must be practical and useful. Is this not what all evolutionists have shown us? How all biology is suitably adapted to its environment because of their practical and useful design. If their information that spoke them into existence was not practical and useful to that entity in its environment, it would die in a matter of days. Okay. In light of the information, this is a quote from Werner Gitt, PhD. In light of the information theories, all materialistic evolution models are useless and are thus rejected.